March, 1945. Picture a road in the Bavarian Alps, narrow and pale, cut into the side of a mountain like a scar that never healed properly. On one side, rock. On the other, nothing at all, just a long grey drop into pine forest and mist. It is snowing. Not the heavy, dramatic snow of films, but the fine, drifting kind that seems less like weather and more like the sky slowly forgetting itself. The flakes come down without hurry. They settle on the road and are immediately crushed by tyres and then, minutes later, settle again. Patient, endlessly patient, waiting for the last vehicle to pass so they can bury the whole thing in silence. 3 trucks are moving south. The headlights are hooded, cut down to thin slits, because Allied aircraft own the daylight now and increasingly own the night as well. The engines strain on the grade. The drivers do not speak. There is very little left to say in March of 1945, when every man in a German uniform knows with absolute certainty how the arithmetic ends, and simply has not been given permission to say it out loud. The war is collapsing behind them. Soviet forces are closing on the eastern approaches to Berlin. American and British armies are crossing the Rhine. The Reich that was promised 1,000 years has managed 12, and is now measured in weeks. And in the middle of that collapse, with fuel more precious than blood, someone has authorised 3 trucks, a fuel allocation, and an armed escort of 11 men to move a single object south into the mountains. Here is what the trucks are not carrying. They are not carrying gold. There is gold moving through Germany in those final months, a great deal of it, on trains and in crates and in the trunks of staff cars, but not here. They are not carrying art. The looted paintings are already stacked in salt mines and castle cellars, waiting for a war to end so that men in white gloves can spend the next 80 years arguing about them. They are not carrying weapons prototypes, not jet engines, not rocket components, not the drawings that will make certain men very valuable to certain governments within the year. They are carrying 1 crate. It is longer than a man and made of granite, not wood, which is why it takes 6 of them to move it, and why the truck bed sits so low over its rear axle. The stone is dark, close to black, and worked so smoothly on its outer faces that snow will not cling to it. It slides off every time, as though the surface will not permit anything to rest there. The crate is sealed with lead at every seam. According to the manifest, which survives in a captured file at a record centre in Virginia, it was recovered in 1939 from an excavation in Tibet. According to the same manifest, its contents are listed as, and I want you to hear this exactly as it is written, geological samples, non-hazardous. 6 men and a stone chest and a road going nowhere in the last march of the war. The convoy stops sometime before dawn. We do not know why. A mechanical failure, perhaps. A blocked pass. A decision made by someone whose name never entered any record. What we know is that when an American patrol comes up that road 11 days later, they find the 3 trucks exactly where the mountain left them, nose to tail, tyres flat, doors standing open, snow drifted halfway up the running boards. There are no bodies. There is no blood. No shell damage. No sign of an ambush. No sign of a fight. The rifles are still in their racks. One of the cabs contains a mess tin with the remains of a meal in it, frozen solid. Another contains a photograph of a woman and 2 children tucked into the sun visor, which the patrol leaves exactly where it is. The rear truck, the low-riding one, is empty. The lieutenant who files the report is 24 years old and has seen a great many stranger things in the preceding year than an abandoned truck. He does what any exhausted officer would do. He records the vehicle numbers, notes the absence of personnel, marks the location on his map, and adds a single line about the cargo listed on the recovered manifest. Cargo missing before arrival. 5 words. That is the entire official history of the granite chest that came out of Tibet. Nobody follows it up. Nobody has time. In the spring of 1945, Allied intelligence is drowning in documents, and a crate of geological samples is not a priority when there are rocket factories and death camps and half a continent of ruin to account for. The file is stamped, boxed, shipped, and stored, and it sits there, quietly, for a very long time. Part 2. The organisation that funded ghosts. Now let us leave the mountain road for a while and go back 9 years and talk about something entirely real. In July of 1935, an organisation was founded in Berlin with a name that translates roughly as inherited from the forefathers. In German, Ahnenerbe. It is one of those words that sounds heavier than it is, like a door closing in a stone corridor. It was on paper a research institute. It had departments. It had a budget. It had a bureaucracy so elaborate that at its height it maintained more than 40 separate research branches, covering everything from Germanic runes to folklore to musicology to plant genetics to the study of the Icelandic sagas. It employed academics with real degrees from real universities. It published papers. It ran symposia. It had letterhead. It was also, in practice, one of the strangest institutions ever funded by a modern state. The Ahnenerbe existed to find evidence for a conclusion that had already been decided. That is the essential thing to understand about it, and everything else follows from that single fact. Its purpose was not to ask questions. Its purpose was to return with answers that supported an ideological story about the deep past, a story in which a particular ancestral people had originated somewhere in the far north, had been magnificent, had been the true source of every ancient achievement, and had been forgotten or suppressed by history. That story was false, comprehensively, embarrassingly false, and known to be false by serious scholars at the time. But it was funded anyway, lavishly. Heinrich Himmler took a personal interest. This is documented and not in dispute. The man who oversaw the machinery of the SS also personally reviewed expedition proposals, personally corresponded with researchers about runes and skull measurements and the possible location of ancestral homelands, and personally pushed for excavations at sites he had become convinced held significance. The academic leadership was given to Walter Wührt, a genuine professor of Sanskrit at Munich. The administration was handled by Wolfram Sievers, a managing director whose name would eventually appear at Nuremberg, and who would be executed because the Ahnenerbe's later work under the Institute for Military Scientific Research crossed from pseudoscience into atrocity in ways this episode is not going to describe in detail because you are trying to sleep, and because those crimes deserve their own careful telling elsewhere, not a footnote in a mystery story. But in its early years, before the war turned it into something worse, the Ahnenerbe mostly did this. It sent men to distant places to look for things that were not there, and it sent a lot of them. There was an expedition to Tibet in 1938 and 39, led by a young zoologist named Ernst Schaefer, accompanied by an anthropologist named Bruno Beger. This one is well documented. They travelled through Sikkim, reached Lhasa, were received by Tibetan officials, filmed a great deal, collected birds and plants and seeds, and measured the heads and faces of hundreds of people using calipers and plaster casts, in service of a racial theory that had no scientific basis whatsoever. They came back with crates. They came back with film. They came back with a reputation, and for a brief moment they were celebrities. There were proposed expeditions to Iceland, to search the landscape of the sagas for physical traces of a heroic past that existed only in literature. Himmler was enthusiastic. The logistics were difficult and the war intervened. There was a fascination with the Andes and with the ruins at Tiwanaku in Bolivia, promoted by a man named Edmund Kiss, who had convinced himself that the stonework there was hundreds of thousands of years old and had been built by northern peoples who arrived in South America in the impossibly distant past. A full expedition was planned for 1939. The war cancelled it. There were digs in Germany itself, at sites like the Externstein, a formation of tall sandstone pillars in a forest in Westphalia, excavated at considerable expense in the hope of proving it had been a great pre-Christian sanctuary. The archaeology did not cooperate. There were surveys in Greece, in Finland, in the Middle East, in North Africa, in Ukraine, in Croatia. There were men in Romania recording folk songs. There were men in Poland cataloguing what they had taken. There were plans, always more plans, for the Canary Islands, for the Caucasus, for the Sahara. The pattern, historically, is easy to describe. A vast, expensive, embarrassing search for an ancestral civilization that had never existed, carried out by an organisation that could not admit failure, in service of a state that punished doubt. And every serious historian who has examined the Ahnenerbe has reached the same conclusion. They found nothing. Which brings us to the conspiracy. Part 3. The 12 missing files. From here forward, we crossed the line. Everything up to this point was history. Everything from here is invention, and I want you to be able to relax into it knowing exactly which is which. The Ahnenerbe was real. Dr. Matthias Keller, whom you are about to meet, is not present day. Keller is 51 years old, an archaeologist by training and an archivist by temperament, which is a polite way of saying that he was never very good at the part of the job that involved sun, and was extraordinarily good at the part that involved paper. His speciality is wartime excavation records. It is a small field. There are perhaps 30 people in the world who do what he does, which is to reconstruct, from surviving documentation, what was dug up in Europe between 1933 and 1945, where it went and where it might be now. Most of his work involves restitution. A crate leaves a museum in Kiev in 1941 and surfaces at an auction house in Zurich in 2019, and someone has to build the chain of custody in between. Keller builds those chains. He works in a converted attic office in Freiburg with one window, 3 lamps, and a filing system that would look like chaos to anyone who was not him. The thing that begins this story is not a discovery. It is an absence. Keller has been working through a set of digitised Ahnenerbe administrative records, the sort of material that is thrilling to about 4 people alive and unbearably dull to everyone else. Requisition forms, fuel allocations, travel authorizations, receipts for tent canvas and photographic plates and pack animals. And what he notices, over the course of several weeks, is that the paperwork is astonishingly complete. This is the thing about that particular bureaucracy. It documented itself compulsively. Every expedition generated a paper trail so dense that you can, 80 years later, reconstruct what a research team ate for breakfast in a valley in Anatolia. Preliminary proposals, budget approvals, interim field reports, final summaries, photographic inventories, specimen catalogues, and then the arguments about all of it afterward, in triplicate. Nearly every expedition has this full arc preserved, except 12. 12 expeditions exist only as departures. Keller finds their authorizations. He finds their budgets, which are large. He finds the fuel, the equipment lists, the names of the men assigned. In 2 cases he finds letters home, intercepted and copied by censors. In 1 case he finds a receipt for the shipping of 11 crates from a port back to Hamburg. And then, for all 12, the record simply stops. No field reports, no summaries, no photographic inventories, no specimen catalogues. Nothing. This is not decay. Keller knows what wartime document loss looks like, and it looks like fire damage, water damage, whole boxes gone in a single bombing raid, gaps that follow the shape of a disaster. This is not that. In every one of the 12 cases, the surrounding paperwork survives perfectly. The proposal is there, the budget is there, the men are there. It is as though someone went through the archive with a very specific list and removed 1 category of thing from 12 separate places, carefully, without disturbing anything around it. Which is exactly what an archivist would do if an archivist had been told to. Keller does what people in his profession do when something itches. He makes a list. 12 expeditions, 12 destinations, running from 1936 to 1943. The southern Tibetan plateau near the Nepalese border, the interior highlands of Iceland, the Bolivian Altiplano, the western desert of Egypt, well south. Of any known site, the High Caucasus, in what is now Georgia, a valley in eastern Anatolia, a stretch of coastline in Morocco, an island in the Aegean, unnamed in the file, given only by coordinates, a location in northern Finland above the Arctic Circle, a plateau in Iran, a site in the Peruvian Andes that appears to have been scouted but never fully excavated, and one entry in Central Asia, with no place name at all, only a set of coordinates and the word glacial. He looks at that list for a long time. Individually, every one of these makes a certain kind of sense within the ideology. Iceland, the sagas; Tibet, the fantasy of northern origins; Bolivia, the Tiwanaku obsession; Egypt, because everyone goes to Egypt. Any one of these locations could be explained away without much effort, but 12 of them, all with their results removed, is not a pattern of belief, it is a pattern of procedure. So Keller does the obvious thing, the thing that any of us would do, and the thing that would occur to no one in 1939 because the tools did not exist. He plots them on a globe, not a map. A map is a lie about a sphere, and he knows it. He plots them in 3 dimensions, in software, on an accurate model of the Earth, and then he sits back and looks at what he has made. They are not scattered. The 12 points sit on the surface of the planet in a configuration that is very nearly regular. Not perfect. Some sit several hundred kilometres from where a strict geometry would place them, which is the sort of variance you would expect if the underlying coordinates had been guessed at from something imprecise. But the shape is unmistakable once seen. Vertices, equal arcs, a structure. Keller runs the calculation twice, then asks a colleague to run it independently without telling her what she's looking at. She calls him back within the hour and asks where he got the coordinate set because it looks generated. He tells her the truth. It was compiled between 1936 and 1943 by men with no satellites, no computers, no accurate global model, and no way of knowing what the finished shape would look like. She's quiet for a moment. Then she says the sentence that will occupy Keller for the next 2 years. They were not choosing locations. They were confirming them. Part 4. The scholar who was looking for engineers. The second thread comes from a shoebox, not a metaphor. An actual shoebox in an estate sale in Basel, containing 70 or so letters and 1 leather-filled notebook. Sold as a lot for a sum small enough that Keller feels faintly guilty about it afterward. The notebook belonged to a man named Ernst Falk. Falk, in this story, was a philologist, a specialist in dead and dying languages, trained in Leipzig, fluent in Sanskrit and Tibetan and Old Persian, with reading knowledge of several scripts that fewer than 100 people on Earth could pass. He was 34 when the Ahnenerbe recruited him, and from what survives he had almost no interest in its ideology whatsoever. That is worth pausing on, because it is one of the genuinely uncomfortable truths about the era. A great many people took the money, not because they believed, because the alternative was to not do the work, and the work was the only thing they had ever wanted to do, and there was exactly one funder in Germany in 1937 who would pay to send a linguist to a Himalayan monastery for 8 months. Falk took the money. His journal is not the journal of a fanatic. It is the journal of a tired, precise, faintly sardonic academic who is extremely good at his job and increasingly unsure what his job is. The early entries are what you would expect: weather, altitude sickness, complaints about the quality of the lamp oil, a long, genuinely funny passage about a colleague who has convinced himself that a local farming implement is a ritual object of enormous significance and who cannot be talked out of it, and who will eventually publish a paper about it. Then, roughly a third of the way through, the tone changes. It changes on the day Falk is called to a private briefing and told what the expedition is actually looking for. He does not write down what he was told. He is too careful for that. What he writes that evening, in a hand noticeably smaller than his usual, is this: "We're not here for artifacts. We're here for the builders." He never explains the term. It appears 14 more times across the remaining pages, always capitalized, always without elaboration, in the way a person writes a word they have been forbidden to define but cannot stop using. The builders wanted the high ground. The builders did not decorate. If the builders left a mark here, it will not be where we are digging, and, in an entry near the end, underlined twice. The others believe we are searching for our ancestors, we are searching for someone else's. Part 5. The directive. The third thread is the one that changes the shape of the whole thing, and it arrives the way these things always seem to arrive, which is to say by accident and years too late. Keller is not looking for it. He's in Koblenz on an unrelated matter, checking a provenance question about a Byzantine reliquary, and he requests a box of SS correspondence, purely because the finding aid mentions a name he recognises. Inside, misfiled among procurement letters about typewriter ribbons, is a 2-page directive. It has no letterhead. It is a carbon copy, 3rd or 4th generation. The type so faint in places that Keller has to photograph it and increase the contrast to read certain words. It is dated the 11th of February 1938 and addressed to expedition leaders by role rather than by name. It is, in its way, an astonishing document because it is written by somebody who already knows what they are going to find. The instructions are these. Ordinary archaeological material is to be documented and then disregarded. Pottery, tools, burials, jewellery, weapons, inscriptions in known scripts. All of it is to be catalogued for the sake of appearances and given no further attention. Priority attention is to be given, exclusively, to 4 categories. First, stone of unusual hardness, specifically stone that has been worked despite being harder than the tools available to whichever culture is credited with the site. Diorite, granite, andesite, anything that should not have been cut but was. Second, metallurgy that cannot be accounted for, alloys, residues, plating or trace deposits inconsistent with the known metalworking of the region and period. Third, astronomical alignment, any structure oriented to a celestial position that does not correspond to the sky as it appeared during the site's assigned age. Fourth, geometry, specifically the recurrence of proportional relationships across sites separated by great distance, where no contact between cultures is possible, and then, at the bottom, a final line that Keller reads perhaps 40 times. Report all instances of the above to the departmental office directly and by courier. Such findings are not to be entered into standard expedition records. Not to be entered into standard expedition records, which is precisely, exactly, why 12 expeditions have no standard records at all. Sit with that for a moment, if you are still awake enough to sit with anything. Someone in Berlin in 1938 wrote a shopping list for anomalies, not a list of things to look for in order to discover something, a list of things to confirm. You do not write instructions that's specific unless you already know the answer and require verification. The question that will follow Keller for the rest of the story, the one he never fully resolves, is not what they found. It is how they knew what to look for. Part 6. The pattern in the stone. Let your breathing slow here. This next part is the quiet part, the part where a man sits alone in an attic for 18 months and compares numbers, and nothing dramatic happens at all, and everything changes anyway. Keller decides to test the directive on his own terms. If the 4 categories were a checklist, then the checklist was derived from somewhere. And if it was derived from somewhere, the pattern should still be visible today, in sites that anyone can measure, using instruments incomparably better than anything available in 1938. So he measures. He takes published survey data, laser scans, photogrammetric models, and ground-penetrating radar results from 6 locations. Real places, all of which you can visit, all of which are genuinely and legitimately mysterious in ways that working archaeologists debate seriously and without any need for invented conspiracies. The Great Pyramid at Giza, in Egypt, whose base is level to within a couple of centimetres across more than 5 hectares, and which is aligned to true north with an accuracy that remains genuinely remarkable. Pumapunku in Bolivia, where blocks of andesite and sandstone are cut with interior right angles, and repeating modular shapes so consistent that they look, to a modern eye, machined, and where the engineering question of how it was done is a real and open one. Göbekli Tepe, in southeastern Turkey, which is the site that broke the timeline. Monumental carved pillars, arranged in circles, erected by people who, as far as we knew, had no agriculture, no writing, no cities, and no reason to build anything at all. It is at least 11,000 years old. It predates Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years. It predates the pyramids by more than 7,000. And then, for reasons nobody has satisfactorily explained, its builders buried it, deliberately, filled it in with rubble and walked away. Baalbek, in Lebanon, where the foundation platform includes worked limestone blocks weighing several hundred tons each, among the largest stones ever moved by human beings, still sitting in a quarry nearby, one of them abandoned mid-extraction, as though somebody stopped in the middle of the sentence. The Osirian at Abydos, in Egypt, a structure of massive rose granite pillars sunk below the water table, so different in style from everything around it that its dating has been argued over for a century. And then a sixth site, and this is the fictional one, so let it be fiction. A cluster of ruins on the southern Tibetan plateau, recorded by exactly one expedition in 1938, photographed 11 times and never visited by any Western team since. Keller is not looking for similarities in style. He's not interested in whether the carvings look alike, because they do not. He's not looking for shared symbols or motifs or building techniques. He is looking at proportions, and what he finds over 18 months of grinding unglamorous work is a set of relationships that keep reappearing. Not the same measurements, the same ratios. The relationship between one dimension and another, expressed as a pure number that does not care what unit you use, that survives translation between cubits and meters and whatever the builders themselves were counting in. At Giza, a specific proportional relationship between the height and the perimeter of the structure. At Puma Punku, the same relationship, expressed in the module of the repeating blocks. At Göbekli Tepe, the same relationship, in the spacing between the central pillars and the radius of the enclosure that surrounds them. At Baalbek, in the dimensions of the largest platform stones. At the Osirian, in the interval between pillars. At the Tibetan site, in the 11 surviving photographs, measured against a survey rod that some conscientious German placed in frame in 1938. The same relationship again. 6 sites. 4 continents, if you're generous about how you count. Separated by thousands of kilometres of ocean, desert and mountain, and by as much as 8,000 years of time. Sharing a number. Now. Here is the part Keller is careful about, and it is the part that makes him a real scholar rather than a man on the internet. He knows how easy it is to find patterns like this. He knows that if you take enough measurements from any complex structure, and you are permitted to divide any of them by any other, you will find pi, and the golden ratio, and the speed of light, and your grandmother's telephone number. This is not a mystery. It is arithmetic and human pattern hunger, and it is the engine that drives 99% of alternative archaeology into the ditch. So he builds controls. He runs the same analysis against a set of medieval cathedrals, against Roman aqueducts, against Mayan pyramids, against a random sample of Iron Age hill forts. He asks a statistician to design the test so that he cannot influence it. He publishes his methodology before he publishes his result, which is the closest thing archaeology has to a promise. The controls come back clean, which is to say, they come back noisy, the way they should. The 6 sites do not. The probability that the relationship appears across all 6 by chance is, in the statistician's careful phrasing, not 0, but not a number she would want to explain to a jury. And underneath all of it, quietly, the fact that will not stop bothering him. Somebody noticed this in 1938, without any of his tools, without laser scanners or satellite imagery or statistical software. Somebody in an office in Berlin, working from photographs and hand measurements, and pure obsessive attention, saw the same thing he had just spent a year and a half proving. and then wrote a directive telling 12 teams to go and confirm it. Part 7, The Black Stone. Folk's journal, 70 pages in, stops being an academic document and becomes something else. The expedition has been working in a valley on the southern plateau for 11 weeks. The site is a temple complex, or was mostly collapsed, of no particular age. The local monastic community has been polite and unhelpful in equal measure. Folk has been transcribing inscriptions that turn out to be 16th century inventories of grain. Then a wall gives way during clearance work, and behind it there is a stairwell. Folk describes the descent in a way that has stayed with Keller. He notes that the steps are of two kinds. The upper flight is what he calls ordinary, hand-cut, uneven, worn into shallow dishes by centuries of feet. The lower flight is not. The lower flight is cut into the bedrock itself, and each step is identical to the others, to a degree Falk cannot measure with the instruments he has. He writes that he ran his fingers along the junction between two of them, and could not find it. At the bottom is a small chamber, and in the chamber, resting on a plinth, is a piece of stone about the size of a loaf of bread. It is black, and it is polished, and it is, in Falk's words, wrong in a way I lack the vocabulary to record. They photograph it, they crate it, they ship it to Germany. And this is where the journal becomes second-hand, because Falk was not present for the analysis, and is reporting what he was later told, which he notes explicitly, because he is a careful man even when he is frightened. The laboratory report, as relayed to him, contains 3 findings. The surface bears no tool marks, not worn tool marks, none. Under magnification, where you would expect to see the microscopic scarring left by abrasion or cutting or polishing, the surface is continuous, as though it had been formed rather than shaped. The material is harder than anything they can test it against, which means the hardness is recorded not as a value but as a failure. The testing apparatus was damaged, and the spectrographic analysis returns composition dominated by known elements: iron, silicon, carbon, in ordinary proportions, alongside a residual fraction of roughly 2% that the laboratory cannot assign to anything on its charts. That last one is the finding that ends the paper trail. The object stops being an archaeological specimen the moment that report is filed, and becomes something else, handled by different people with different clearances. Falk writes, in the last entry that mentions it directly, "They have taken it to the physicists. I asked to be informed of the results. I was told that I would be informed if it became relevant to my work. I do not think anything will ever again be relevant to my work." After 1944, the sample vanishes from German records entirely. Part 8. The language that had no gods. If you're still with me, and you may not be, and that is entirely the point, this is the section where the story turns from objects to meaning. Falk was a linguist. The stone was interesting to him, but the stone was not his problem. His problem was the writing. In the same chamber, cut into the walls in a shallow, even line, at roughly shoulder height, is a script. He knows immediately that it is not Tibetan. It is not Sanskrit or any Brahmi derivative. It is not Chinese, not Sogdian, not Kharosti, not any of the trade scripts that move through those mountains. He rules out, over several weeks, every writing system that a man with his training can rule out, and he was trained by the best there were. What he is looking at has 3 properties that he records with increasing unease. It has a very small character set, fewer than 30 distinct signs repeated. That suggests an alphabet or a syllabary rather than a logographic system, which in turn suggests a certain level of linguistic sophistication. The signs are constructed from a limited set of strokes combined in what appears to be a systematic way, as though the alphabet itself had been designed rather than evolved. Real scripts, the ones that grow out of drawing and habit over centuries, are messy. They carry the fossils of their own history. This one carries none, and the inscription is repetitive in a very particular manner. Certain sequences recur at regular intervals, at what Falk eventually realises are measured distances along the wall rather than at grammatical intervals. He describes it, in a moment of frustration, as being less like a text and more like a label. The decipherment takes him 14 months, and it happens back in Germany, in a requisitioned room in a building he never names, and it happens because of a repetition. 3 of the sequences also appear on the black stone arranged around one face, and one of those sequences appears in a form altered but recognisable, in an inscription photographed at an entirely different site, on a different continent, by a different expedition, which Falk has access to only because he has been given clearance to the courier files that ordinary expedition members never see. That is the wedge. That is the crack he gets his fingers into. He never achieves a full translation. He is explicit about this, repeatedly, in a way that Keller finds almost unbearably honest. What he achieves is a partial reading of perhaps a fifth of the recurring elements, with confidence in maybe half of those arrived at through structural inference rather than any bilingual key. But the partial reading is enough, because of what is absent. There are no gods in the text. Falk searches for them specifically, because every ancient inscription he has ever handled in his entire career is soaked in them. Dedications, invocations, curses on those who deface, genealogies of kings descended from divinities. It is the constant background radiation of the ancient world, present in Egypt and Sumer and the Indus and Mesoamerica, present everywhere humans have ever carved anything. There are none here. There are no kings either, no conquests, no tribute lists, no boasts about the number of enemies slain, which is the other great subject of ancient writing. What there is, as far as Falk can determine, is specification. The recurring sequences appear to encode quantities and relationships. One cluster he reads with moderate confidence as a measurement of angle, another as a ratio, another as a reference to a direction, though whether magnetic or celestial he cannot say. And one sequence, the one that appears most often, the one that opens the inscription and closes it, he translates with what he calls reasonable confidence, and then writes out 3 separate times on the same page as if to check that it does not change. Those who make, not priests, not sons of heaven, not the beloved of any deity, makers, engineers. Falk writes, and this is one of the passages Keller reads aloud at a conference in 2023, to a room that goes very quiet. I have spent my life reading the words of people who wish to be remembered as favoured by gods. These people wish to be remembered as competent. It is the loneliest thing I've ever read. Part 9. What the tablets described. The tablets. Let us talk about the tablets, and then let us go underground. From Falk's partial readings, and from 3 other fragmentary sources referenced in the courier files, a picture assembles. It is incomplete, and Keller presents it as incomplete, and I will do the same, because the gaps are the honest part. A civilization existed. Its own texts place it more than 12,000 years ago, at the tail of the last glacial period, when the seas were more than 100 metres lower than they are now, and the coastlines of the world were drawn in shapes no human map has ever recorded. It was not, by its own account, an empire. This is the detail that separates it from every fantasy of a lost golden age ever written, and it is the detail Keller finds most persuasive, precisely because it is such a bad story. Invented civilizations are always empires. They always have capitals and kings and a sunken palace. Human beings, when we make up a lost world, cannot help but make it a bigger version of the ones we already know. The builders had no capital. What they had was a network. According to the reading, they constructed sites at specific points on the surface of the earth. Not cities, installations, each one placed with respect to the others according to a geometry that treated the whole planet as a single object. The sites were not there to be lived in. They were there to do something individually and together, and it is at exactly this point that the translation becomes untrustworthy, because Falk is a linguist attempting to render technical vocabulary from a discipline that has no name in any language he knows. The word he settles on provisionally and hedges with 3 separate qualifications is listening. The sites listened, or measured, or resonated. Some verb that sits in the space between those 3, describing a relationship between a structure and the ground beneath it and the sky above it. And then there is one final passage near what appears to be the end of the sequence, which Falk translates twice and marks both times with a question mark. The first reading is, "We did not finish." The second reading is, "It was not finished with us." He notes that the grammatical structure of the language does not clearly distinguish between the two, and that he suspects it may not have needed to. Now, if any of that is true, and remember that none of it is, then here is what it means for everything you have ever been taught about the ancient world. The pyramids are not the beginning of anything. They are the last surviving members of a much older family. Built 4,500 years ago by people who were themselves inheritors, working from proportions and orientations passed down through 8,000 years of copying, from a source nobody in dynastic Egypt could have named. Not descendants of the builders, descendants of the ruins of the builders, taking their measurements from structures that were already ancient and already mysterious when the first Egyptian looked at them. That is why the pattern survives, not because a secret was kept, because a shape was copied, over and over, by people who no longer knew why, and who assumed, as we always assume, that if a thing has always been done this way, then it must be sacred. Göbekli Tepe becomes something else in this reading too, not a temple, a node, and its deliberate burial, that strange unexplained decision to fill it in with rubble and abandon it, becomes not an act of piety, an act of decommissioning. Part 10, The Chamber Beneath the Mountain, 1940, the 8th of the 12 expeditions. They go back to the valley on the southern plateau, the one with the stairwell, and this time they bring engineers. The dig takes 7 months. The chamber where the black stone was found turns out to be an anteroom, and beyond its rear wall, behind fill that has been placed deliberately rather than collapsed accidentally, there is a passage. The passage runs downward at a shallow, consistent grade for 400 metres. At the end of it is a door. Falk was not on this expedition. His account is reconstructed from the courier reports he was later given access to, and he says so, and Keller repeats the caveat every time he discusses it. What follows is third hand, in a story that is entirely invented. Hold it loosely. Let it be a thing you are told rather than a thing you must believe. That is what makes it good to fall asleep to. The chamber beyond the door is roughly circular and roughly 60 feet across, and it is empty except for what stands at the centre. A ring, concentric rings more precisely. 3 of them, cut from the same black material as the stone from the anteroom, set into the floor and rising perhaps waist height, nested one inside the other with gaps of a hand's width between. There are no gears. There is no mechanism visible anywhere, no hinges, no sockets, no evidence that anything was ever attached. There are no inscriptions on it at all, which the report notes with something like a fence, because everything else at the site is covered in them. The surfaces are cut to a tolerance the expedition's engineer, a man who had spent his career in precision manufacturing, describes as beyond the capacity of the workshops he had trained in. And then things begin to happen, and the report shifts from description into a flat, careful, increasingly unhappy list. Compasses do not work in the chamber, not erratically. They rotate slowly and continuously in one direction, at a rate the engineer measures at roughly 1 full revolution every 90 seconds, regardless of where in the room they are placed. Photographic plates fog, all of them, sealed, unexposed, still in their light-tight holders, developed later at the surface, uniformly clouded in a way that any modern reader will recognise as looking very much like radiation exposure, and which nobody in 1940 knows how to interpret. Mechanical watches lose time, all of them, at the same rate, and here is the strange part. They lose time only while in the chamber. Brought back up, they run correctly again, permanently behind but no longer slipping. 2 chronometers left at the surface as controls show nothing. One team member reports hearing a colleague call his name, turns to answer, and is told the man has not spoken. 4 minutes later, the man calls his name, and there is one incident, recorded in a single sentence and never elaborated on anywhere in the file, that Keller says he does not know what to do with. A researcher standing near the inner ring is observed by 2 others to be, and the report uses the word displaced. He is found several feet from where he was. He does not report having moved. He does not report anything at all, having no memory of the intervening interval, which the observers estimate at less than 2 seconds. The expedition is suspended within a week. The site is sealed under an SS classification, with a code word that appears nowhere else in any surviving document. In the courier file, in a different hand, is the name they give it, the Meridian Engine, Part 11. The men at the top never knew. Here is where the story departs most sharply from the version you've probably encountered before, in films and paperbacks and late-night documentaries with too much orange lighting. In the popular mythology, the Nazi leadership is obsessed with the occult. Hitler personally hunting relics. Himmler in a candlelit castle chamber conducting ceremonies. A regime driven from the top by mystical conviction. The historical reality is more mundane and more interesting. Himmler's interest in ancestral pseudo-archaeology was real and expensive and well documented. Hitler's was not. Hitler was, by multiple accounts of people who worked closely with him, openly contemptuous of that entire line of inquiry, and is recorded complaining about the absurdity of digging up crude pots to prove ancestral greatness, while the Greeks and Romans were building temples. That is genuine history, and it undercuts the movie version rather badly. In this fiction, that contempt is the accident that hides everything, because the Meridian Engine is never reported upward. The compartmentalization is not a conspiracy of silence at the top. It is a conspiracy of embarrassment in the middle. A small group inside the Ahnenerbe, perhaps 9 people, perhaps 11, understands roughly what has been found, and understands with total clarity that if they escalate it, one of 2 things will happen. Either they will not be believed, and the funding will end, and the site will be handed to somebody with a shovel and an ideology, or they will be believed, and it will be taken from them and given to the weapons programs, and the men who arrive will not be interested in what the rings are for. They will be interested in what the rings can be pointed at. So the group does what small groups of frightened specialists have always done inside large organisations. They keep filing paperwork that says archaeology. They keep requesting budgets for excavation supplies. They keep sending the leadership photographs of pottery. And they quietly redirect an increasing share of those budgets into physics. Folk's journal contains, near the end, a list of names with their disciplines beside them. It is a roster of who is actually working on the project by 1942, and it contains not 1 archaeologist, 2 crystallographers, a geophysicist, 3 specialists in electromagnetic theory, a mathematician, 2 engineers, and Folk, who observes dryly that he appears to have been retained as the only person present capable of reading the instruction manual. The men in Berlin believe they are funding a search for ancestors. The men in the chamber are doing experimental physics on an object they cannot open, cannot date, and cannot explain, and are getting results they are afraid to write down. Part 12. What the Allies actually noticed. Nobody in London believes in Atlantis. That is the thing to hold on to. British intelligence in 1944 is not staffed by mystics. It is staffed by exhausted, extremely clever, deeply unromantic people who are trying to work out where the next rocket will land. What they notice is an anomaly in resource allocation. It comes out of signals traffic and captured documents, cross-referenced by an analyst whose job is to track German scientific priorities by following the money and the men. And what she sees, in late 1944, makes no sense at all. Germany is losing. Materials are catastrophically short. Programs are being cancelled weekly, including good ones, including programs with obvious military value that are 2 years from delivering something genuinely dangerous. And in the middle of that triage, A small number of highly qualified physicists are not being reassigned. They are being protected. Their exemptions are being renewed. Their fuel allocations are being honoured when frontline units are running dry. And they are attached on paper to an archaeological research office that has no conceivable relevance to the war. The analyst writes a memo. It is 4 paragraphs long, and its conclusion is 1 sentence. Either this office is being used to conceal something of military value, or somebody very senior is protecting a personal enthusiasm at extraordinary cost. Recommend the former be assumed. That memo is the entire reason anyone comes looking, not because of a legend, because of an accounting irregularity. Part 13. Operation Archive. After the surrender, the great scientific harvest begins. The real one is well documented and its name is familiar. Operation Paperclip, in which the United States recruited German scientists and engineers, most famously the rocket teams, brought them to America, sanitized their records where necessary and put them to work. The Soviets ran their own version, the British ran theirs. Thousands of men who had built weapons for one side spent the next 20 years building them for another, and some of them ended up putting a flag on the moon. That is history, and it is a genuinely uncomfortable piece of it. In this fiction, there is a second operation running alongside it, sharing its cover, using its transport and its clearances and its paperwork. It does not recruit anybody. It collects. Small teams, 4 or 5 men, moving fast, ahead of the historians and ahead of the museums and ahead of the restitution commissions. They arrive at monasteries in the Alps and at castle cellars and at a salt mine in Thuringia. They have lists. They take journals, photographic plates, stone samples, survey notebooks, and maps. They are not looking for the objects themselves. Most of the objects are already gone, moved south in the last months by convoys like the one on that mountain road. They are looking for the coordinates, for the survey work, for 8 years of extraordinarily careful measurement carried out by people who did not know what they were measuring. Because the objects are useless without the map, and the map exists in 12 field notebooks scattered across a ruined continent. Keller tracks the fate of the 12 expedition archives across 4 decades, and the pattern he finds is a masterpiece of quiet administration. 3 go west and are absorbed into an American technical intelligence program, declassified in 1991 with 60% of their content withheld under exemptions that have been renewed twice since. 4 go east and disappear into a Soviet institute in the Urals, which was formally dissolved in 1992, and whose holdings were transferred to an agency that has never confirmed receiving them. 2 remain in British custody and were, according to a written parliamentary answer, destroyed in a routine disposal in 1968. 2 were purchased privately at auction in the 1950s by a Swiss foundation that has never published a catalogue and has declined every access request made to it, including his. And 1 is in a shoebox in an attic in Freiburg, because in 1945 a linguist mailed his notebook to his sister, and nobody thought to look for it there. Part 14. The last pages. The final entries in Falk's journal are written in 1944, and describe a return to the chamber and a descent past it. Beneath the room with the rings, reached through a shaft that the engineers had spent a year clearing, there is a second and much larger space. It is a hall. Falk estimates 200 feet across. Arranged around its circumference, cut from the bedrock, are seats, hundreds of them, in tiers facing inward, the way seats face inward in a lecture theatre or a council chamber or an operating room. They are simple and they are worn smooth, and Falk notes that they are sized for people almost exactly the size of the men standing in the room, which he says he found more disturbing than if they had been giant. At the centre, where the focus of all those seats converges, is a low circular platform. There is nothing on it. There is no treasure in the hall. No statues, no bodies, no grave goods, no gold. Nothing that any excavation in the history of the discipline would consider a find. There is 1 line of text, cut into the floor at the base of the platform, and Falk translates it in the last legible entry in the notebook, and then writes nothing else for 11 pages, and then writes only a date, and then stops. Knowledge survives only when pride does not. He does not comment on it. He does not need to. He is a German academic in 1944, standing in a hole in the Himalayas, working for an organisation that has spent a decade trying to prove its own ancestors were the greatest people who ever lived, reading a sentence carved 12,000 years ago by somebody who apparently learned that lesson the hard way. The ceiling of the hall is a star map. It is not decorative. It is dense and precise. Thousands of points, cut to varying depths to indicate what can only be magnitude. When Keller finally gets Falk's tracing of it in front of modern software in 2022, the result takes about 4 minutes. The sky depicted is Earth's sky, as seen from that latitude approximately 12,400 years ago, accounting for precession, which is, on its own, remarkable but not impossible. Ancient people watched the sky obsessively and recorded it well. But one region of the map does not resolve. There is a star charted where no star is, and where, according to every catalogue we have, no star has been within the span of recorded human observation. The astronomers Keller consults offer him 3 explanations, and are honest about all 3. A transcription error, a recorded transient, a nova or supernova, faithfully charted by people who saw something bright and did not know it was temporary, or an object that has since moved or dimmed beyond detection. Any of those is more likely than the 4th explanation, which is that the sky itself has changed since the map was cut, and that the map is older than the ceiling it is carved into. Keller does not argue for the 4th explanation. He simply notes, in his paper, that the map is internally consistent in every other respect, and that its makers do not otherwise appear to have made errors. Part 15. It was never a weapon. Everyone who ever touched this material assumed the same thing, and every one of them was wrong. The Germans assumed it was a weapon because they were fighting a war, and everything looks like a weapon from inside a war. The Allies assumed it was a weapon for the same reason. The men who inherited the files in the 1950s assumed it was a weapon, because by then the world had watched 2 cities disappear, and the imagination of every government on Earth had permanently narrowed. Keller comes to it 80 years later without a war and sees something else. The rings are not an emitter. Nothing about them is directional. There is no aperture, no focus, no way to aim. A weapon is a thing you point, and this cannot be pointed at anything. What it can do, apparently, is affect the local behaviour of time and magnetism in a small volume of space, in a way that is stable, repeatable, and entirely without any obvious output, which is a very strange thing to build, unless the point is not the effect but the reference. The word Falk hedged over, the one he rendered as listening, sits at the centre of it. The sites were placed at specific points on a sphere, in a fixed geometric relationship to one another, and each one did something to the local field that could presumably be detected by the others. That is not a weapon. That is a positioning system. It is, when Keller finally says it out loud in a lecture hall in Utrecht, so obvious that several people in the audience laugh, not unkindly in the way people laugh when a thing rearranges itself in front of them. We built one. We built ours out of satellites because satellites were the tool available to us, and we hung 30 of them in orbit and taught them to agree on the time so precisely that the disagreement between them tells a device on the ground exactly where it is standing. Our version required leaving the planet. Their version, if it existed, required only stone, placed exactly, tuned to the field of the Earth itself. Not navigation for ships, not navigation for aircraft. Navigation on the surface of a world, at a scale where the world itself is the instrument. And there is an implication in that which Keller states once and never repeats, because it is the point at which he can feel the edge of his own credibility. You do not build a global positioning network unless you have somewhere to go. Part 16. The agreement nobody signed. By 1949, 3 governments have pieces of this, and none of them has all of it, and each of them knows that the others are looking. There is no treaty. There is no meeting, no signature, no room with 3 men and a document. What there is, in this fiction, is something quieter and far more plausible, which is 3 separate institutions independently arriving at the same conclusion and independently deciding to sit on it. The reasoning is identical in all 3 cases, because the reasoning is not difficult. If this becomes public, every nation on Earth will attempt to build one, not because of what it does, but because of what the others might learn from it. The race will be immediate and it will be total, and it will happen in a decade in which the great powers have already demonstrated exactly how they behave when a new physics appears. And the sites are not in anybody's territory. They are in Tibet and Bolivia and Iran and Egypt and the Caucasus, which means the race would not be a research program, it would be a series of occupations. So the material is classified, not under a single grand program with a memorable name, which is how conspiracies work in films, but under a dozen unrelated national security categories in 3 languages with no cross-reference between them. Geological survey, geophysical anomaly, technical intelligence, foreign, archaeological materials, restricted. It is the most effective concealment ever devised, and it required no conspiracy at all, just filing. The historians are left with what remains, which is to say, with the Ahnenerbe as a joke, a cautionary tale about ideology corrupting scholarship, skull calipers and rune obsessives and a professor of Sanskrit lending his name to nonsense. All of that is true. That is the part that makes it work. You do not need to hide a secret if the cover story is genuinely, verifiably, humiliatingly accurate. Part 17. The perfect copies. There is one more thing Keller finds, and it is the smallest thing in the entire investigation, and it is the one that keeps him awake. He's checking provenance on a set of stone fragments in a European museum, artifacts recovered by one of the 12 expeditions and returned to public collections in the 1950s. Routine work. He has done it 1,000 times. The fragments are wrong, not obviously. Not in any way a visitor would ever notice, or a curator, or frankly any specialist who was not doing precisely the thing Keller happened to be doing that afternoon. They match the wartime photographs. They match the dimensions in the catalogue. They match the described composition. They match too well. Stone Ages. It weathers, it accumulates, it responds to 70 years of gallery lighting and handling, and the breath of 1 million visitors. These fragments are identical to their 1944 photographs, in details that should have changed and have not. He requests permission for materials analysis. It is refused politely on conservation grounds, which is a normal and entirely reasonable refusal that museums issue constantly. He requests it at 2 more institutions holding material from the same expeditions. Refused. Refused. He does not know, and says he does not know, and will not claim otherwise. But he raises the possibility, once, in a footnote, that at some point in the 1950s, a small number of objects in public collections were exchanged for reproductions, that the originals went into storage facilities under national security classification, and that nobody has ever noticed, because the copies are excellent, and because the fundamental assumption of every person who has ever walked through a museum is that the thing behind the glass is the thing. The public sees the copies. The originals are somewhere with a climate control system and an inventory number and no visitors at all. Part 18. The site under the ice. 12 points make the shape. 11 of them have been visited. 11 have been excavated or partially excavated, or at minimum surveyed by men with theodolites and cameras between 1936 and 1943. The 12th was never reached. It is the entry in the file with no place name, only coordinates, and the word glacial. Central Asia, high, remote, and in 1943, entirely inaccessible. The expedition was authorised, the budget was approved, the equipment was purchased, and then it was postponed. and postponed again, and then there was no longer a Germany to postpone it from. Keller runs the coordinates against modern satellite data and against ice-penetrating radar surveys conducted for entirely unrelated glaciological research. Beneath roughly 90 metres of ice at that location, there is a void. It is not a natural cavity. Natural cavities in bedrock are irregular. This one has a floor plan, and it completes the geometry. With 11 points, the shape is suggestive. With 12, it closes, which raises the question that ends the investigation and, in a sense, ends the story. The builders did not finish their network, or the network was finished and something happened to it. Or, and this is the reading Keller comes to prefer, and he is careful to call it a preference rather than a conclusion, somebody took it apart. Because Göbekli Tepe was buried on purpose. Because the rings have no inscriptions when everything around them does. Because the Great Hall has hundreds of seats and nothing to look at. Somebody switched it off. Epilogue, the doorway. I want you to be almost asleep for this part. If you are, let it come to you the way the end of a story comes to you when you're nearly under, in fragments, without needing to be held onto. Keller goes. It takes 3 years to arrange, and the permits are extraordinary, and the expedition is nothing like the ones he has spent his career reading about. No pack animals, no plaster casts, no calipers, a thermal drill, a survey team, 6 people, and a satellite uplink. The shaft takes 19 days. The chamber at the bottom is dry and colder than the ice above it, and completely silent in a way that people who have been in deep caves will recognise and nobody else can be told about. At its centre, on a floor of the same black material, there are 3 concentric rings. They are identical to the ones described in a courier report filed in 1940 and last read by a man who died in 1962. And the air above the innermost ring is moving. Not much. A shimmer, of the kind you see above a road in summer, occupying a disc perhaps a metre across, entirely stable, entirely silent. The instruments do what the instruments in 1940 did. The compasses turn, the clocks slip. One of the team's phones records 4 seconds of audio that nobody in the chamber produced, and which analysis later shows to be a recording of the team's own conversation from 11 minutes earlier. And Keller, who has spent 2 decades of his life on paper and has never once claimed to have seen anything, walks to the edge of the ring and looks into the shimmer. He reports afterward, in a statement he gives once and never expands on, that he saw a city. Towers of pale stone in a landscape that was not ice, a sky the wrong colour for the hour, and figures small with distance moving along a road, going somewhere, in the entirely ordinary way that people go somewhere on an ordinary afternoon. It lasted, he thinks, less than 2 seconds. Then the air was only air, and the thing he takes from it, the thing he says quietly at the very end, is not wonder, and it is not fear. It is a correction. They did not vanish. Civilizations that vanish leave bodies, and ash, and abandoned meals, and the debris of the last bad day. There is none of that anywhere in the network. No war damage, no mass graves, no panic. They left carefully. They shut down the sites behind them, one by one, in order. They buried the entrance at Göbekli Tepe with their own hands, and took the inscriptions off the rings and swept the Great Hall clean, and the last thing they did before they went was carve 1 sentence into the floor where whoever came next would be standing. Knowledge survives, only when pride does not. The network was never a defence system. It was never a weapon, and it was never a temple. It was a door, and they used it, and they closed most of it behind them, and they left one open. The final twist. History remembers the Ahnenerbe as an organisation that spent a fortune chasing myths, runes and sagas and ancestral fantasies, and the ruins of a golden age that never existed. Every serious historian agrees. They looked for legends, and legends were all they ever found, because legends were all there was. According to the conspiracy, That judgment is correct in every detail except one. They did find myths. The myths were just misfiled history. Every civilization on Earth carries a story about a time before, about builders who came before the builders, about a knowledge that was lost and a world that ended in water. We file those stories under folklore because we know, with complete confidence, that there was nothing before us worth remembering. The Ahnenerbe went looking for proof that their ancestors had been the first great people on this planet. They found proof that nobody's were, and that, according to the conspiracy, is the reason none of it was ever released. Not because it was dangerous, because it was humiliating to every nation that held a piece of it, in exactly the way the sentence on the floor had warned it would be. The final line. The world believes the Ahnenerbe searched for Atlantis, for sacred relics, for forgotten legends, and came home with nothing but embarrassment. According to the conspiracy, they came home with something far more dangerous. A map to the technology of a civilization that existed before history began, and a doorway proving it may never have truly disappeared. Now. Let all of that go. None of it is waiting for you. There is no chamber under the ice with your name on it, no convoy on a mountain road, no sentence carved in a floor 12,000 years ago that you have to do anything about tonight. It is a story, and stories are the safest place in the world to put your attention when you are trying to stop thinking. Before we get into tonight's story, a massive thank you to JT, WildMT, and Jeff Anon for suggesting this one. You already know who you are, and the channel wouldn't be the same without you. And to everyone listening right now, wherever you are in the world, drop your video ideas in the comments below. We read every single one. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and look up at the sky one last time before you close your eyes. There is something above you right now. Not a threat, not a sound, not a presence you can feel or name or point to with any certainty. Just the sky, open and pale, and carrying the kind of quiet that only comes after the sun has finished its work and the world has settled into the long exhale of night. You have looked at that sky your entire life. You have watched clouds form and dissolve. You have tracked planes crossing overhead, their lights blinking in the dark, trailing thin white lines that fade within minutes and vanish as though they were never there at all. But what if they did not vanish? What if, on certain mornings in certain places, those lines did not fade? What if they spread, slowly, methodically, the way ink bleeds through wet paper? until the sky above a small farming community in central Kansas was no longer quite the colour it used to be. What if the light reaching the ground felt different? Thinner, metallic, like sunlight seen through frosted glass rather than open air? What if the farmers noticed? And what if, when they began to ask questions, the answers they received were not answers at all, but the careful, practiced silence of institutions that had already decided the public did not need to know? Tonight's story is called Operation Silver Veil. It is a story about the sky. It is a story about science and secrecy, and the particular kind of moral paralysis that settles over powerful people when they believe they're carrying a burden too heavy for the rest of us to bear. It is a story about a farmer named Eli Harper, a whistleblower who called himself Dr. Nathan Hale, and a program so deeply embedded in the infrastructure of modern aviation that it operated in plain sight for years, visible to everyone, explained to no one. Some of what follows is documented, some is alleged. All of it will make you look at the sky differently in the morning. The summer of 2016 arrived in central Kansas the way it always did, with a heat so specific and physical that it pressed down on the fields like a hand. The wheat had come in early that year. The soybeans looked promising. Eli Harper, who had worked the same 412 acres his grandfather had broken ground on in 1941, rose at 5 every morning, drank his coffee on the porch while the sky shifted from black to grey to the particular shade of blue that farmers have always read like a language, and then went to work. Eli was not a dramatic man. He was not prone to conspiracy. He had voted in every presidential election since 1982, filed his taxes on time, attended the same Methodist church his family had attended for 3 generations, and held the quiet, practical worldview of a man who had spent his entire adult life in direct negotiation with reality, with soil composition and rainfall totals and the 30-year price history of soybeans on the Chicago Board of Trade. He was, in the most essential sense, a man who dealt in facts, which is why, when the sky began to behave differently, he noticed. It started in late June. A Tuesday, he would later write in the journal he had kept since 2002. He was standing in the east field checking soil moisture when he saw the first one, a white line drawn across the upper atmosphere by a plane passing at altitude, the kind of contrail that commercial aircraft produce routinely as water vapour in their exhaust freezes in the cold air of the upper troposphere. He had seen thousands of them. He was not alarmed, but this one did not fade. In his experience, contrails lasted anywhere from a few seconds to perhaps 2 minutes in dry atmospheric conditions, or somewhat longer in more humid air before they dispersed and became invisible. This line remained. It remained for 20 minutes, then 40, then an hour, and by the time Eli drove his truck back to the equipment shed for the midday break, the original line had spread, horizontally, the edges softening and blurring, until it had transformed from a thin white scratch across the blue into something that resembled, unmistakably, a cloud, an artificial cirrus layer approximately 2 miles wide and spreading. He dismissed it. He had things to do. But then there was another one the following Thursday, and 2 more the following Monday, and by the middle of July, Eli Harper was watching the sky above his farm transform, on certain mornings, into a kind of aerial gridwork. Parallel lines spaced at even intervals, running northeast to southwest, laid down by aircraft he could see but not hear, operating at altitudes his eye suggested were significantly higher than the commercial passenger lanes he was accustomed to observing. He bought a camera, not a sophisticated one, a consumer-grade DSLR mounted on a tripod on the roof of his equipment barn, pointing straight up, set to take a photograph every 3 minutes from dawn to dusk. He did not tell his wife what he was doing. He was not sure he could explain it himself. He simply felt, with the particular certainty of a man who has spent decades reading the sky, that something was different and that he wanted a record of it. What the photographs showed him, when he began reviewing them in the evenings on his laptop, stopped him cold. The aircraft were flying in formation, not in any military sense. There were no wingtip formations, no close groupings, but the flight paths were geometrically precise. Aircraft 1 would cross the eastern horizon on a heading of approximately 240 degrees. 45 minutes later, Aircraft 2 would cross on an identical heading, displaced perhaps 12 miles to the north. Then Aircraft 3 displaced another 12 miles north of that. Then, after a pause of perhaps 90 minutes, the sequence would begin again from the southern end, heading northeast. The same spacing, the same altitude, the same methodical march across the sky above his farm. By August, Eli had documented 47 separate overflights in his journal, each logged with date, approximate time, bearing, and observed trail duration. His photographs showed, with unmistakable clarity, a persistent overhead pattern that did not resemble any commercial flight path he had ever observed. He pulled up FlightAware on his laptop. FlightAware is a publicly accessible aircraft tracking platform that aggregates data from ADS-B transponder signals broadcast by commercial aircraft. It is the system that allows anyone with an internet connection to watch, in near real time, the movement of thousands of planes across the national airspace. Eli typed in the coordinates of his farm and began matching the timestamps of his photographs against the aircraft shown in the tracking system. The commercial flights were there. He could track them precisely. The American Airlines regional jets out of Wichita, the UPS cargo aircraft crossing north to south on their Memphis to Denver route, the occasional southwest flight cutting across at high altitude. He knew their schedules. He could match their transponder signals to his photographs with a precision that satisfied him. But the aircraft flying the grid, the ones producing the trails that stayed and spread, were not there. Not one of them appeared on FlightAware. Not on the day he first noticed them in late June. Not on the 12 subsequent days he checked specifically to confirm the discrepancy. The aircraft were visible to his eyes and to his camera. They did not exist, as far as any public tracking system was concerned, in the national airspace at all. Eli Harper sat with that fact for a long time. He was emphatic about this in everything he would later write and publish. He was not someone who believed in government conspiracies. He had spent 20 years dismissing the kind of talk that floated around the county fair and the barbershop and the waiting room at the farm co-op, the talk about black helicopters and microchips and fluoridated water. He was not that man. He was, he kept reminding himself, a man who dealt in facts. The fact was that aircraft were crossing his sky in precise geometric grids and leaving behind persistent chemical trails that expanded into artificial cloud cover, and those aircraft did not appear on the public tracking systems that were supposed to show all commercial air traffic, and his crop yields, which had been remarkably consistent for 7 years, had dropped by 11% that summer, despite rainfall totals that were entirely within historical norms. Those were the facts. He drove to the Reno County Library in Hutchinson and asked for help finding information about historical government weather modification programs. The librarian, a woman named Geraldine Marsh, who had worked in the reference section for 26 years, looked at him carefully for a moment, then turned to her terminal and began typing. She pulled 3 books and printed 17 journal articles. One of them mentioned something called Operation Popeye. There are things governments have already admitted to doing to the atmosphere. This is not speculation. This is not the kind of fringe assertion that requires you to accept extraordinary claims without evidence. The evidence is in the congressional record. It is in declassified military documents. It is in the academic literature that followed the public disclosure of programs that, for years, existed only in the realm of rumour and denial. The history of government atmospheric intervention is real, documented and far more extensive than most people are aware. Operation Popeye began in 1967 and continued through 1972. It was a classified United States Air Force weather modification program conducted during the Vietnam War, and its objective was precisely what its name suggested, to make it rain. Specifically, to extend the Asian monsoon season over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the network of jungle supply routes through which North Vietnam moved weapons and equipment to forces operating in the south. The theory was straightforward. More rain meant more mud. More mud meant impassable roads, flooded fords, collapsed trail sections, logistics disrupted, supply lines severed. The war made harder for the enemy. The method was cloud seeding, the dispersal of silver iodide particles from aircraft flying over target clouds, which caused water droplets within the clouds to nucleate and precipitate as rainfall at a higher rate than they would naturally. The technology had existed in civilian form since the late 1940s, when General Electric scientist Bernard Vonnegut, older brother of the novelist Kurt Vonnegut, first demonstrated that silver iodide could reliably induce precipitation. The Air Force had simply taken a civilian technology and applied it to a military objective. Operation Popeye flew approximately 2,618 sorties over a 5-year period. The Air Force later claimed the program produced measurable increases in rainfall over targeted areas. Whether it actually shortened the war, extended it, or had any appreciable strategic effect remains disputed among military historians. What is not disputed is that the United States government conducted a sustained covert atmospheric modification program over a sovereign foreign nation for 5 years without public disclosure. The program was exposed by journalist Seymour Hersh in 1972, confirmed by a Senate investigation in 1974, and ultimately led to the Environmental Modification Convention of 1977, an international treaty prohibiting the use of environmental modification techniques as weapons of war. 36 nations signed it. Eli Harper read about Operation Popeye in the Reno County Library and felt for the first time that the ground beneath his certainties had shifted slightly. Because the lesson of Operation Popeye was not simply that governments could modify weather. The lesson was that governments had modified weather in secret for years, while publicly denying that any such capability existed or was being employed. The denial had continued until a journalist with classified documents made it impossible. He read further. He found Project Cirrus, a 1940s joint program between the US Army Signal Corps, the Office of Naval Research, and General Electric that conducted the first intentional weather modification experiments in American history, including an attempt to weaken a hurricane by seeding it with dry ice that may have caused it to change course and make landfall near Savannah, Georgia. He found Project Storm Fury, a 1960s and 70s program in which the US Navy seeded Atlantic hurricanes with silver iodide in an attempt to weaken their intensity. He found the China National Weather Modification Office, a bureau of the Chinese government employing more than 35,000 people to conduct cloud seeding operations over Chinese territory. A program not only publicly acknowledged, but actively promoted as an agricultural and drought management tool. He found, in a 1996 paper prepared by the Air University at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, a document titled Weather as a Force Multiplier, Owning the Weather in 2025, which proposed a roadmap for how the United States military could develop the capability to control the weather as a strategic and tactical asset by the year 2025. The document described technologies including aircraft-dispersed aerosols for cloud formation, artificial fog and precipitation, and atmospheric heating using high-frequency radio transmissions. It was a publicly available document. It was produced by the United States Air Force. Eli Harper sat in the library for 4 hours. When he walked back to his truck in the parking lot, he looked up at the sky over Hutchinson, Kansas, and watched a white line spread slowly across the upper atmosphere. He drove home and began making phone calls. On the morning of June 15th, 1991, the Mount Pinatubo volcano on the island of Luzon in the Philippines erupted in the second largest volcanic eruption of the 20th century. The statistics are almost too large to comprehend. The eruption ejected approximately 10 cubic kilometres of material into the atmosphere. The eruption column rose 35 kilometres into the sky, penetrating well into the stratosphere. In the days that followed, approximately 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide were lofted into the upper atmosphere, where they reacted with water vapour to form a fine aerosol of sulfuric acid droplets distributed across both hemispheres. The aerosol cloud spread. It thinned. It became invisible to the naked eye, but it was present in the stratosphere for months, and it did something that atmospheric scientists had theorized but never observed on such a global scale. It reflected incoming solar radiation. The particles acted as tiny mirrors. A fraction of the sunlight that would normally have passed through the atmosphere and reached the surface was instead scattered back into space. The effect was small. The aerosol layer reduced the amount of solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface by approximately 2 to 3%. But 2 to 3% applied globally is an enormous amount of energy. The year 1992 was the coolest year on Earth since 1979. Global mean temperatures dropped by approximately 0.5 degrees Celsius. Agricultural patterns shifted. Summer temperatures in the northern hemisphere were measurably lower than in any year since the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815. In atmospheric science laboratories around the world, researchers watched the Pinatubo data accumulate and drew a conclusion that seemed, at the time, almost too convenient to be safe. If a single volcanic eruption could measurably cool the entire planet by distributing reflective particles into the stratosphere, then perhaps human beings could do the same thing deliberately. The idea had a name: stratospheric aerosol injection. It was not, even in 1991, an entirely new concept. Scientists had been discussing the theoretical possibility of artificially enhancing Earth's albedo, the technical term for the proportion of incoming solar radiation that the planet reflects back into space, since at least the 1970s. But Pinatubo transformed the conversation from theoretical speculation into empirical science. Here was proof of concept. Here was the planet itself demonstrating that aerosol injection could work. The academic discussion intensified through the 1990s. Papers appeared in peer-reviewed journals. Conference sessions were dedicated to the topic. The phrase solar radiation management entered the climate science vocabulary, and somewhere in the corridors of government agencies and defence contractor offices, where the boundary between public scientific discourse and classified programme development is not always clearly marked, people began asking a different question. Not, could this work? Pinatubo had answered that. The new question was, should we wait for a political consensus that may never come, or should we begin? In 2014, Eli Harper received in the mail, forwarded through 3 intermediaries, each of whom had been instructed to pass it along without asking questions, a photocopy of what appeared to be the executive summary of an internal academic grant proposal dated to the early 2000s. The document was 14 pages long, the header had been redacted, the names of the principal investigators had been redacted, the institution through which the grant had been processed had been redacted. What remained was the body of the proposal itself, and it described in the precise, technical, undramatic language of grant applications a program called the Atmospheric Reflectivity Initiative, or ARS. The stated goals of the Atmospheric Reflectivity Initiative were as follows: to reduce the net radiative forcing experienced at the Earth's surface through the controlled distribution of reflective aerosol particles at stratospheric altitudes, to develop and test delivery mechanisms capable of operating at sufficient altitude and scale to produce measurable effects on regional temperature profiles, to establish baseline atmospheric monitoring protocols capable of detecting and attributing changes in albedo to program operations, and to assess the biological, agricultural and climatological side effects of sustained aerosol distribution with sufficient rigour to inform ongoing program decisions. The language was careful. It was the language of science. It was also, Eli would later note in his published account, the language of a program that had already made its central decision and was now focused on the details of implementation rather than the question of whether implementation should occur. The proposal did not describe the program as theoretical. It described it as in transition from the research phase to the operational phase. It referenced aircraft platforms already in service. It referenced dispersal systems already tested. It referenced atmospheric modelling data already accumulated over a period of several years of what it called limited-scale deployment. limited-scale deployment. Eli read those 3 words several times. He thought about the grid patterns above his farm. He thought about the aircraft that did not appear on public tracking systems. He thought about his crop yields and his soil tests, and the metallic quality of the afternoon light in the summer months. And he thought about the 14-page document he was holding, which described, in the language of bureaucratic routine, a program that had apparently been putting things into the atmosphere above civilian populations for years without asking anyone's permission. He drove to the post office in Hutchinson and mailed 3 copies of the document to 3 different addresses: a journalist in Denver, a university professor of atmospheric chemistry in Austin, Texas, and his own attorney, with instructions to hold it unopened unless he failed to make contact within 30 days. Then he went home and waited. 5 days later, his phone rang at 2:17 in the morning. The caller identified himself only as Nathan. He said he had been expecting Eli to surface eventually. He said he had something Eli needed to hear. He called himself Doctor Nathan Hale, which was almost certainly not his real name, a fact that Eli acknowledged freely, noting that the choice of alias was itself a message, Nathaniel Hale having been the American Revolution's most famous spy, executed by the British in 1776 after being caught gathering intelligence behind enemy lines. His last words, as they have come down through history, were reported to be, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." Whether the pseudonym was chosen for its historical resonance or its note of grim self-awareness, Eli never determined. What he determined, over the course of 11 phone calls conducted through encrypted channels over a period of 4 months, was that Nathan Hale was a former aerospace contractor with a background in avionics systems engineering, that he had worked for at least 2 major defence contractors over a career spanning approximately 20 years, and that he had been involved, directly, technically, instrumentally, in the modification of aircraft systems for purposes that, he said, he had not fully understood at the time and had come to understand only gradually over years, as the full scope of what he had helped build became clear to him. He did not want to be a hero. He was explicit about this in their earliest conversations. He was not motivated by idealism or political conviction, or any particular desire to expose wrongdoing for its own sake. He was motivated, he said, by the specific practical knowledge that the program he had helped build had grown beyond the scope its original architects had intended, and that the people currently running it had developed a particular relationship to their own justifications, the kind of relationship in which the justifications had gradually displaced any other kind of moral accounting. He used a phrase that Eli would remember for the rest of his life. "They stopped asking whether it was right," Nathan said during their 3rd call. "They started asking whether it could continue. Those are very different questions, and once you make the switch, you never go back." What Nathan described, over those 11 calls, was a program that had begun as a genuine response to what he characterized as a genuine emergency. In the early 2000s, he declined to give a specific year, but suggested it was before 2005, a series of internal government assessments had concluded that global warming was proceeding at a rate significantly faster than the publicly available consensus suggested. These were not rogue assessments. They were, he said, produced by the same agencies and the same scientists whose public statements suggested a more measured and uncertain picture. The gap between the public statements and the internal conclusions was not, he emphasised, a product of scientific dishonesty. It was a product of the recognised fact that releasing the most alarming projections publicly would cause panic without providing any mechanism for response, and that the political systems of democratic nations were constitutionally incapable of responding to a threat on the timescale that the internal assessments described. And so a decision was made somewhere above the level at which Nathan operated, and well above the level at which Eli could ever independently verify, to begin what the documents Nathan had seen called emergency climate stabilisation measures, a phrase that sounded, he noted, very much like the kind of language that is designed to make decisions that have already been made appear both reasonable and inevitable. The program had been given a name, Operation Silver Veil. Before Eli received the documents from Nathan, before the phone calls, before the encrypted files and the carefully worded anonymous messages, Before any of that, Eli Harper did what farmers do when they want to understand what is happening to their land. He tested it. He collected rainwater samples, not once, not casually, but systematically. From rooftop cisterns, from collection trays he set in the open fields, from the guttering along the barn roof, capturing what fell from the sky during and after the days when the grid patterns were most visible overhead. He labelled the samples with date, collection location and time. He packaged them in sealed containers and drove them, himself, to a commercial environmental testing laboratory in Wichita, where he paid out of pocket for a full elemental analysis using inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, the most precise available method for detecting trace elements in water samples. He did not tell the laboratory what he expected to find. He presented the samples as routine agricultural water quality testing. The results came back in 3 weeks. The laboratory report was 42 pages long, dense with numerical data and reference ranges and margin of error calculations. Eli was not a chemist, but he was a careful reader of technical documents, a man who had spent decades parsing soil test reports and fertilizer specifications and water rights agreements. He worked through the report methodically. Most of what it contained was unremarkable. The standard profile of Midwestern rainwater, consistent with what he had tested in prior years. Nitrogen compounds from agricultural runoff, trace sulfates from industrial emissions, the expected background levels of common minerals carried in precipitation. But 3 things stood out. Aluminum compounds, specifically aluminum oxide particulates, were present at levels approximately 4 times higher than the reference baseline for clean rainwater in Kansas. The laboratory had flagged this as anomalous and noted that it could indicate proximity to industrial aluminum processing or manufacturing, though the report noted that no such facilities were located within a distance consistent with atmospheric transport of such particles. Barium salts were present at levels approximately 2.3 times the reference baseline. Barium is a soft alkaline earth metal with no natural mechanism for entering the atmosphere at significant concentrations except through industrial combustion or deliberate dispersal. Its presence in rainwater at elevated levels was, the laboratory noted, unusual. Strontium particulates were present at levels approximately 3 times the reference baseline. Like barium, strontium has limited natural pathways into the atmosphere. The laboratory flagged the finding and recommended follow-up testing to rule out proximity to nuclear waste storage or processing facilities, none of which existed within a radius consistent with the contamination profile. The report, taken as a whole, did not accuse anyone of anything. Laboratory reports do not make accusations, they report data. But the data, the elevated aluminum, the barium, the strontium, pointed toward a single coherent hypothesis, that the rainwater falling on Eli Harper's farm contained substances that had been introduced into the upper atmosphere by a mechanism other than natural atmospheric processes. Eli photographed the report, mailed copies to his attorney and to the journalist in Denver, and began researching the atmospheric chemistry of aluminum oxide, barium sulfate, and strontium chloride. What he found was that all 3 of those substances had been discussed in the academic literature on stratospheric aerosol injection as candidates for use in solar radiation management programs. Aluminum oxide, in particular, had been proposed in several published papers as a potentially more effective alternative to the sulfate aerosols produced by volcanic eruptions, on the grounds that it scattered light more efficiently and degraded more slowly in the stratosphere. A 2008 paper by a researcher at the Carnegie Institution for Science had specifically analysed the optical properties of aluminum oxide particles and found them well suited to the kind of sustained reflective enhancement that solar radiation management programs would require. The substances in his rainwater were not random. They were not industrial byproducts from a source he could not identify. They were, according to the academic literature, precisely the substances that someone designing a stratospheric aerosol injection program would choose. Nathan confirmed it on their 4th call. before Eli had told him about the laboratory report. Aluminum, barium, strontium, Nathan said, and he was not asking a question. Nathan spent most of their fifth call describing the aircraft. He was specific in the way that engineers are specific, not in the way of storytellers who select details for emotional effect, but in the way of people who think in systems and tolerances and material specifications. He described modifications to existing tanker-class aircraft, wide-body platforms originally designed for aerial refuelling operations that involved the installation of secondary tank systems in the lower fuselage, plumbed through dedicated lines to nozzle assemblies integrated into the exhaust pathways of the main engines. The elegance of the design, he said, with what Eli would later describe as a kind of weary admiration, was that it made the dispersal invisible. Not invisible to satellites or to sophisticated tracking systems, but invisible to the casual observer on the ground, because what emerged from the aircraft looked to any eye like ordinary contrail. A standard jet contrail forms when hot, humid exhaust gases from the engine mix with the cold, low-pressure air of the upper atmosphere, causing water vapour to condense and freeze into ice crystals. The visual result is a white line. An aircraft equipped with a secondary dispersal system was emitting, simultaneously with its normal exhaust, a fine aerosol of reflective particles. Those particles seeded the condensing water vapour. They made the resulting ice crystals more numerous, smaller, and more stable than they would otherwise be. The trail that formed was not a contrail. It was a contrail aerosol composite, visually indistinguishable from a normal contrail, but carrying a payload of aluminum and barium and strontium that would persist in the atmosphere long after the ice crystals had sublimated. The flights, Nathan said, were scheduled to blend with commercial traffic windows, that period of each morning when commercial flight density is highest. An aircraft flying a grid pattern at 40,000 feet, surrounded by the normal scatter of commercial traffic, was effectively hidden in the noise. No single observer on the ground could distinguish it from a routine transcontinental flight. Only someone with both the photographic record and the flight-aware data, someone who could demonstrate that a specific aircraft at a specific position was not present in the transponder system, could establish that it was anything other than an ordinary plane. The aircraft did not broadcast ADS-B transponder signals because they operated under a national security classification that exempted them from the transponder requirements imposed on commercial aviation by the FAA. The exemption was not a violation of aviation law. It was a provision written into the regulatory framework specifically to accommodate government and defence operations that required a degree of operational security. The aircraft were not invisible to air traffic control. A TC knew they were there, but the information was compartmented, not shared with the public data aggregation systems that fed platforms like FlightAware. The fleet was not enormous. Nathan estimated, and he was careful to call it an estimate based on his knowledge of the program's operational parameters rather than any direct count, that the operational aircraft numbered somewhere between 80 and 120 platforms, spread across multiple bases and operated through civilian aviation subcontracting arrangements that placed several additional layers of bureaucratic insulation between the flights and any agency that might be asked to account for them. The subcontracting structure was, Nathan said, the program's single most important protection, because when journalists or congressional investigators went looking for evidence of an atmospheric modification program, what they found was not a secret government fleet. What they found was a series of contracts with aviation companies that were, in their public-facing operations, entirely unremarkable. The government had learned from decades of classified program management that the most durable cover is not secrecy. Secrecy can be cracked. The most durable cover is complexity. Spread the program across enough contractors, enough budget lines, enough operational categories, and the truth becomes not hidden, but obscure, buried not in a vault but in the routine accumulation of paperwork. Eli was a farmer. He knew his land from the ground. But in the spring of 2015 he was introduced, through a contact at a university agricultural extension office, to a man named Marcus Webb, who spent most of his waking hours doing something that Eli had not previously understood was possible to do as an amateur. Marcus Webb tracked satellites. He was 53 years old, a retired electrical engineer from Salina, Kansas, who had converted his garage into what he called, without particular grandiosity, a ground station, a room containing a directional antenna array on the roof, a battery of computers running orbital prediction software, and a receiver system capable of pulling image data from certain Earth observation satellites that transmitted in the unencrypted bands accessible to civilian equipment. The images were low resolution by professional standards, but they were images taken from orbit of the atmosphere over North America, and Marcus had been collecting and analysing them for 7 years. When Eli showed Marcus his journal and his time-lapse photographs and his flight-aware comparisons, Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he pulled up a folder on one of his computers. The images showed something that Eli, looking at the sky from the ground, had been unable to fully appreciate: the scale of what was happening. Seen from above, the artificial cloud formations produced in the wake of the grid flights were not the thin, localized wisps they appeared to be from the surface. They were extensive, they were coherent, and their boundaries were, in a way that no natural cloud formation ever is, geometrically consistent with the flight path that had produced them. Natural cirrus clouds form along temperature and humidity gradients in the upper atmosphere. Their shapes are determined by the interaction of water vapour with temperature inversions and wind shear, processes that produce clouds with irregular fractal boundaries, clouds that thin and thicken in response to atmospheric conditions that vary continuously across space. They do not have straight edges. They do not form in parallel bands equally spaced at intervals consistent with a grid of flight paths. The formations in Marcus's images had straight edges. They formed in the hours following grid overflights. They persisted for periods of time, sometimes 16 to 20 hours, far longer than natural cirrus typically persists in the same atmospheric conditions. And in the multispectral analysis that Marcus ran on the imagery, comparing the reflectivity of the artificial formations against the reflectivity of surrounding natural cloud cover, the artificial formations showed significantly higher albedo values. They reflected more sunlight than natural clouds of comparable optical thickness. Eli looked at the images for a long time. "What do you call this?" he finally asked. Marcus thought about it. "Geoengineering," he said. "The word for it is geoengineering." On their 7th call, Nathan described what he believed had been the decision point, the moment at which the Atmospheric Reflectivity Initiative had transitioned from a research program with theoretical operational implications to an operational program with the paperwork of research as its cover. He described it as a classified summit, a meeting somewhere in the spring of 2003 that had brought together a specific and unusual combination of participants. Senior officials from the Department of Energy's Office of Science, representatives from at least 2 defence contractors with long records of classified atmospheric research, a small number of climate scientists who had been brought inside the security classification for the purpose of this discussion, and officials from an interagency coordinating body whose name Nathan had seen on documents but would not repeat. The meeting, as Nathan understood it from the documents he had later accessed, had been convened in response to a specific set of internal assessments produced in 2002 and 2003, assessments that concluded, based on modelling that the producing agencies did not consider appropriate for public release, that the global climate system was approaching a series of tipping points on a timeline that was dramatically shorter than the publicly stated scientific consensus suggested. Nathan was careful here. He did not claim that the public consensus was wrong in its basic direction, only that the internal assessments placed the relevant timeline significantly closer than the public model suggested. The difference was not one of magnitude, but of urgency. Publicly, the conversation in 2003 was about what might happen to global temperatures by 2100. Internally, according to the documents Nathan had seen, the conversation was about what might happen by 2050 or 2040 or, in the most alarming of the assessed scenarios, even sooner. The summit had produced a conclusion. The political systems of the world's major democracies were structurally incapable of responding to the threat on the timescale the internal assessments described. International climate negotiations were proceeding at a pace determined by the political calendars of 197 sovereign nations, each pursuing its own economic interests, each constrained by the electoral pressures of governments that served 4-year or 5-year or 6-year terms. The physics of the climate system did not operate on electoral timescales. The physics did not wait for consensus, and so the summit reached a conclusion that Nathan said had been described in the documents he had seen in language of extraordinary flatness, the language of people who have spent long enough with a difficult decision that it has ceased to feel difficult. The decision was to begin, not to wait for public approval, not to seek international coordination through the channels that existed for that purpose, not to announce the programme, submit it to democratic deliberation, allow the public to weigh its risks and benefits and make a collective choice. To simply begin, quietly, using existing aircraft and existing infrastructure and existing classification authorities, and to call it research until it was so embedded in the atmospheric system that stopping it would be more dangerous than continuing. The meeting had lasted 2 days. The document summarising its conclusions was, Nathan believed, classified at a level above top secret, a level that created its own compartment and its own access controls, so that the number of people who knew the full scope of what had been decided was, by design, very small. How small? Eli asked. Nathan thought for a moment. Small enough, he said, that it has never leaked. He paused. Until now. The documents that Nathan described contained something that Eli found, in some ways, more disturbing than the revelation of the programme itself. They contained the debate, not the decision. The decision, as Nathan had explained, had been made at a level and in a forum that left only conclusions in the paperwork. But below that level, in the working groups and subcommittees and technical review panels that had been convened to advise on implementation, there was a record of people arguing with each other, questioning the programme, raising objections, and then, in document after document, arriving at the same terminus. The core ethical problem was simple to state and impossible to resolve. The programme required public consent to be legitimate. Public consent required public disclosure. Public disclosure would cause panic, economic disruption, international political crisis, and, perhaps most practically, demands from dozens of nations that the programme be immediately stopped. Stopping the programme, by the point at which disclosure became a live question, would be extremely dangerous, because by then the atmosphere had already been altered. The albedo of the upper atmosphere over targeted regions had been measurably increased. The amount of solar radiation reaching the surface had been measurably reduced. The global temperature trend had been measurably deflected, not eliminated, not reversed, but deflected, bent slightly downward from the trajectory it would otherwise have followed. If the programme stopped, the deflection would stop. The trajectory would resume, and because the deflection had been operating for years, the resumption would not be gradual. It would be abrupt, a rapid rebound in temperature that atmospheric scientists called termination shock. The aerosol particles in the stratosphere would gradually fall out over a period of months, and as they did, the full warming effect that the programme had been suppressing would re-emerge, compressed, concentrated, potentially catastrophic. The programme had created a dependency. The atmosphere, or more precisely, humanity's relationship to the atmosphere, had been reorganised around the assumption that the aerosol layer would continue. Stopping was no longer simply a policy choice. Stopping was a trigger, and so the ethical trap closed on itself with the elegant, horrible logic of a system that had been designed without an exit. The documents Nathan described showed working group members arriving at this realisation from different directions and at different speeds, but arriving at it nonetheless. One memo, which Nathan quoted from memory in what Eli would later describe as a recitation so precise it did not feel like memory at all, contained a line that had apparently been written by a climate scientist who had been brought into the program from a major research university and who had resigned their position there to do so. The line read, "We have created a situation in which truth is the most dangerous available option." Nathan said he did not know what had happened to the scientist who wrote it. Eli was not the only farmer who had noticed. He knew this in the abstract, knew it because the internet existed, and because the topic of aerial trails had generated a specific and long-standing corner of online discussion, populated by people with a wide range of credibility and motivation. He knew it because some of the people in those discussions were clearly driven by things other than evidence: political anger, general distrust of institutions, a desire for a narrative that organised the ambient anxiety of modern life into something with a specific author and a specific villain. He had tried, in the first months of his own investigation, to keep his distance from those discussions. He did not want his thinking contaminated by conclusions that had been reached before the evidence was examined, but as the months passed and the evidence accumulated in his own files, the photographs, the flight-aware comparisons, the laboratory reports, the ARI document, the calls with Nathan, he began carefully to reach out to other farmers in other states. He found them through agricultural extension networks, through county co-op mailing lists, through the quiet, slow-moving channels of rural America's information economy, the kind of communication that happens through trusted intermediaries over the course of months rather than in viral social media moments. What he found was not in any sense a movement. It was a dispersed, disconnected collection of individual observations, most of which the observers had never tried to connect to anything larger than their own experience. But the observations rhymed. Farmers in Ohio reported altered rainfall timing, not reduced rainfall, not drought, but shifts in the seasonal distribution of precipitation that did not match historical patterns or regional weather forecasts. A corn farmer in Nebraska told Eli, in a phone call that lasted 2 hours, that his soil tests had been returning anomalous mineral profiles for 3 years. Elevated aluminum, he said, before Eli mentioned the word. A fruit grower in the Central Valley of California described something she called the shimmer days, afternoons in late summer when the sunlight had a quality she could not precisely name but consistently noticed, a diffusion and flatness that made shadows behave differently than they should. Several farmers in different states mentioned respiratory issues, not among themselves initially, but among farm workers and in the communities adjacent to their operations. Not dramatic spikes in illness, not medical events that anyone had flagged as an emergency, but a low-level, persistent increase in the kind of inflammatory respiratory conditions, chronic cough, shortness of breath, irritated airways, that are typically associated with elevated fine particulate matter in breathable air. Medical researchers in the academic literature had noted similar trends in various populations, always with careful caveats about the difficulty of isolating causation in complex environmental systems, always with conclusions that fell short of attributing the trends to any specific source. No single cause had been confirmed. The regulatory agencies that would normally be responsible for investigating such trends, the EPA, the FDA, state health departments, had received reports and conducted reviews and produced findings that consistently attributed the observed changes to known and conventional sources: industrial emissions, wildfire smoke, seasonal pollen, the routine variability of environmental exposure. None of them had investigated the one hypothesis that would have required investigating the aircraft. Nathan had an explanation for that. On their 8th call, Nathan described the second layer of the program, not the atmospheric layer, the political one. The decision-makers who had authorised Operation Silverveil had understood from the beginning that the program's greatest vulnerability was not technical. Aircraft could be modified, schedules could be maintained, budgets could be concealed within larger discretionary line items, classification authorities could be applied. All of those challenges were manageable by people with the institutional resources to manage them. The greater vulnerability was the public, not because the public was likely to discover the program through independent investigation. The architects had, correctly, assessed that the barrier between a genuine suspicion and a documented proof was, for most individuals, practically insurmountable. The vulnerability was subtler than that. The vulnerability was that some people were already looking up. Some people were already photographing the sky and comparing notes and running their own informal analyses. The internet had created a distributed observation network that no classification authority could fully suppress, because the observers were not themselves classified, and the sky was not classified, and the trails were visible to anyone who looked. The solution was elegant in the way that solutions designed by people who think about human psychology rather than physical security tend to be elegant. If you cannot prevent people from noticing, you can control what they do with their noticing. You can create a context in which the act of raising the question places the questioner, in the minds of their peers and in the media and in the public discourse, into a specific category, the category of people who believe irrational things. You can ensure that the dominant cultural framing of the observation is not careful civilian investigator, but conspiracy theorist. You can ensure that when a journalist is assigned to cover the story they find is not the programme, but the people who believe in the programme, the fringe, the unstable, the credulous, and that the contrast between those people and the smooth, reasonable, credentialed voices of institutional denial is so stark that the question itself is answered before it is examined. This is not, Nathan said on the 8th call, a hypothetical strategy. It is a documented approach to managing public perception of sensitive programs, taught in communication strategy courses at major universities, applied routinely in the management of public relations for industries from tobacco to pharmaceuticals to defence procurement. The specific application to what would come to be called the chemtrail conspiracy theory had, according to Nathan, been the subject of an internal memorandum. He had seen a summary, not the document itself, that described social stigma as the programme's primary containment mechanism. Not classification, not operational security, not the complexity of the contracting structure. Social stigma. The most effective protection for Operation Silver Veil was the certainty, embedded in the culture, that people who worried about what was in the sky were crazy. Eli thought about the conversations he had not had in the years before he started documenting, the times he had dismissed the talk at the co-op without examining it, the times he had read an online discussion about chemtrails and scrolled past it with a slight private contempt. He thought about how long the sky had looked different before he allowed himself to notice. Eli had begun his investigation above a single Kansas farm. He had not intended to go further than that. He was not an international researcher or a policy analyst or a foreign correspondent. He was a farmer, and his primary concern was his land and his crops and the sky above them. But the satellite imagery that Marcus had been accumulating did not respect the boundaries of Reno County, Kansas. It showed the whole planet. And what it showed, when Marcus began organising it along the dimensions that the investigation had identified, flight patterns, cloud formation persistence, albedo anomalies, was not a phenomenon localised to the American Midwest. The patterns appeared over Western Europe, over the agricultural regions of France and Germany and the Netherlands, where famously precise farmers had been noting changes in sky behaviour and crop patterns and soil chemistry that they discussed in their own language, in their own agricultural journals, in their own forums, discussions that had generated exactly the same cultural responses in North America, the same reflexive dismissal, the same containment. The patterns appeared over parts of Australia, the heavily agricultural southeastern regions in particular, where the temperature profile of summer had been shifting in ways that the Bureau of Meteorology attributed to global climate patterns, but that farmers in the Mallee and the Wimmera described in terms strikingly consistent with what Eli had described to Marcus in the garage in Salina. The patterns appeared at lower density but measurable regularity over parts of East Asia, over agricultural regions in China and Japan and Korea, though here the analysis was complicated by the fact that China maintained an acknowledged domestic weather modification program, which made it difficult to distinguish the operations of Silver Veil from the operations of the China National Weather Modification Office, which was not covert and involved many of the same types of aircraft and aerosol dispersal technologies. Nathan, when Eli brought the global pattern to his attention on their 9th call, was not surprised. The program, he said, had always been conceived at a global scale. A regional aerosol injection program would be inadequate to the task. The atmosphere circulates on a global basis, and a program designed to manage global temperature could not be limited to national airspace without sacrificing the scale required for effectiveness. The international expansion had, according to what Nathan understood of the program's development, proceeded through arrangements that he described as aerosol coordination frameworks, bilateral and multilateral agreements negotiated at a level above most existing diplomatic channels, justified under national security authorities that created their own information compartments. He believed these arrangements were referenced in internal documents produced for certain United Nations climate discussion forums, not in the public records of those forums, but in the preparation documents circulated to delegates with appropriate security clearances. The public face of those discussions had consistently denied any operational deployment of geoengineering technologies. The internal face, Nathan said, was different. Eli asked how many governments knew. Nathan said he thought the better question was how many governments did not know, and that the answer to that question was probably only the ones too small and too poor and too strategically unimportant for the program to need their airspace. Marcus Webb had been tracking something else. For 4 of the 7 years he'd been collecting satellite imagery. He had also been building a database of extreme weather events, not because he was particularly interested in extreme weather, but because he had noticed in the earliest phases of his atmospheric analysis that the regions showing the strongest albedo anomalies were not evenly distributed across the planet. They were concentrated, with a regularity that eventually became undeniable, along the path of the jet stream, the high-altitude, high-velocity ribbon of air that circles the planet in the upper troposphere and drives much of the weather in the middle latitudes. The jet stream is not a fixed feature. It meanders. It strengthens and weakens. It splits and rejoins. Its behaviour in any given season is one of the most important determinants of weather patterns across the Northern Hemisphere. Drought and flood, cold snap and heat wave, all of them connected in complex ways to the specific behaviour of the jet stream in that period. And the jet stream, Marcus had been documenting, was behaving erratically, not in ways that were individually inexplicable. Any single anomalous pattern in the jet stream could be attributed to the natural variability of a complex atmospheric system, but in ways that, when mapped against the satellite imagery and the documented flight patterns and the albedo anomalies, showed a statistical signature that Marcus found deeply troubling. The aerosol layers, it appeared, were interfering with the thermal gradients that drove and stabilized the jet stream. The injection of reflective particles into the stratosphere reduced surface heating in targeted regions. That reduction in surface heating altered the temperature differential between the equator and the poles, the differential that is the fundamental driver of jet stream behaviour. A weaker differential produced a weaker, more meandering jet stream. A more meandering jet stream produced more extreme and persistent weather patterns. Longer droughts where the ridge of high pressure locked in place. Longer flood events where the low-pressure system stalled, sharper cold air intrusions when the polar vortex, destabilised by a weakened jet stream, spilled southward. The program designed to stabilise the climate, in other words, appeared to be destabilising the weather. Marcus put this in writing and gave it to Eli in the form of a 37-page technical analysis, accompanied by graphical comparisons of the satellite imagery and atmospheric modelling outputs. Eli read it twice, and then called Nathan. Nathan listened without interrupting. When Eli finished, Nathan said, "I know." "You know," Eli said. "It's in the program documents," Nathan said. It was flagged as a potential consequence in the early modelling. The conclusion was that the magnitude of the destabilisation effect was smaller than the magnitude of the warming effect it was counteracting, that the exchange was acceptable. "Acceptable to whom?" Eli asked. Nathan did not answer immediately. "To the people who made the decision," he finally said. to the people who had already decided that any side effect was preferable to the alternative they believed they were preventing. Eli received the final communication from Nathan on a Sunday morning in March. It came not as a phone call but as a file, an encrypted archive of approximately 3.4 gigabytes, transmitted through a protocol that Eli had spent 2 weeks learning to use under Nathan's guidance on their 10th and 11th calls. The decryption key arrived 48 hours later through a separate channel, in the form of a handwritten note mailed from a post office in a city Eli did not recognise. He spent 4 days working through the archive. What it contained was not a single document but a structured collection. Deployment schedules organised by region and quarter, atmospheric density targets expressed in technical notation that Eli needed Marcus's help to interpret, flight manifests organised by aircraft identifier codes that had no correspondence to any civilian aviation registry, internal program reviews that assessed progress against targets using metrics Eli had not previously encountered. And at the end of the archive, in a folder labelled simply with a date 18 months in the future from when Nathan had sent it, was a document titled Termination Scenario, Atmospheric Modelling Assessment. The termination scenario document was 61 pages long. Eli read it in a single sitting, beginning at 10 in the evening and finishing at 3 in the morning, with Marcus beside him for the technical sections. What it described was what the program's own scientists had modelled as the consequence of a complete and unmanaged cessation of aerosol injection. The scenario that would occur if the program was suddenly exposed, publicly discredited, and forced to halt. The model showed a rapid rebound in surface temperature, what atmospheric scientists call termination shock. Without the aerosol layer, the solar radiation that the program had been reflecting back into space would resume reaching the surface within weeks of cessation. Because the aerosol particles have a relatively short residence time in the stratosphere, they gradually fall out over a period of 12 to 24 months depending on particle size and atmospheric conditions. The rebound would not be instantaneous. It would develop over the course of approximately 18 months, during which global mean surface temperatures would rise at a rate significantly faster than anything in the instrumental record. The models, and here Eli and Marcus sat together in a long silence, showed a temperature increase over the 18 months following cessation of approximately 1.4 to 2.2 degrees Celsius above current levels, imposed on top of the existing anthropogenic warming baseline. The combined effect in the most severe modelled scenarios was described in language that was clinical in the way that clinical language is always most devastating. Cascading agricultural system failures across multiple major food-producing regions. Accelerated Arctic sea ice loss with associated permafrost methane release. Disruption of monsoon precipitation patterns affecting populations dependent on rain-fed agriculture across South and Southeast Asia. Accelerated sea level rise from ice sheet destabilization in Greenland and West Antarctica. The document did not use the word catastrophe. It did not use any emotionally charged language at all. It used the language of systems analysis and probability distributions and confidence intervals. But what it described through that language was the collapse of the conditions under which the current human civilization had organised itself, and the document had been produced by the program's own scientists, for the program's own administrators, as an internal assessment of what would happen if their program was stopped. Eli sat in the dark in his equipment barn in central Kansas, with the cursor blinking at the end of the termination scenario document, and thought about what he was holding. He thought about the 120 aircraft crossing the sky somewhere above him in the dark. He thought about the 63 million tons of aerosol particles that the deployment schedule suggested had been injected into the stratosphere over the preceding decade. He thought about the jet stream data that Marcus had assembled, and the farmers in Ohio and Nebraska and California whose observations rhymed with his own, and the laboratory report with its elevated aluminum and barium and strontium. And he thought about the thing that Nathan had said on their very first call, the thing he had said before he had told Eli anything else, as though he needed to establish this condition before any other conversation could occur. "There is no good outcome," Nathan had said. "That's the first thing you need to understand. Whatever you do with what I'm about to tell you, whatever you decide, whatever you choose, there is no outcome in which everyone is safe, and the truth is known, and everything is fine. The program's architects made a choice that removed that option. That choice was made years ago by people you and I will never meet. We are living with the consequences of it. All we get to choose is which consequence. Eli Harper spent 6 months doing nothing. He tells this to the people who know the story, and the number of people who know the story in its full form is very small, because he has chosen carefully and deliberately not to publish it in full. He tells it not as a confession or an apology, but as a factual account of what it is like to be in possession of information that cannot be safely released and cannot be morally suppressed. He thought about his children. He has 2 daughters, one in Wichita, one in Denver. He thought about his grandchildren, who were 9 and 7 years old when he was reading the termination scenario document in the equipment barn at 3 a.m. He thought about what kind of world they would inherit if the program continued, and what kind of world they would inherit if it stopped, and he found that the 2 answers were indistinguishable in their uncertainty, that neither path led anywhere he could see clearly, and that the choice between them was not really a choice he had the standing to make for anyone other than himself. He thought about democracy. He had believed in it his entire life, in the quiet, practical way of a man who had voted in every election and attended town hall meetings and served on the county water board for 12 years. He believed that the people who are affected by decisions have the right to participate in making them. He believed that this was not merely a political preference, but a moral principle, that there was something fundamentally wrong with decisions that affected everyone being made by a small group of people who had decided, for reasons they believed were good, that everyone else could not be trusted to participate. He believed this. And he also looked at the termination scenario document and understood, with the same cold clarity with which he read soil test reports, that making the case for democratic accountability in this particular instance required accepting a risk that he could not quantify, and could not contain, and could not recover from if he was wrong. He spent 6 months not deciding. Then he made a partial decision. Not the full disclosure that the journalist in Denver had been pressing him towards since their first contact. Not the full suppression that a voice inside him, the voice that sounded, he noted, very much like the voice in the program documents, the voice of people who had decided that others could not be trusted, was also pressing. Something in between. Something that made the existence of the question knowable, without making the full weight of the answer inescapable. He published a summary, anonymously, through an intermediary he trusted, to a platform where it would reach people who were already asking questions about the sky, people who would understand it, people who were already looking up. He uploaded it on a Wednesday night, then closed his laptop and went to bed. The response to Eli's publication was, as he had anticipated, divided. In the communities where the question had already been alive, the forums and groups and online spaces where people had been pointing cameras at the sky and comparing notes and arguing with each other for years, it was received as confirmation of something they had already believed. This was both its strength and its weakness as a document, because the people most capable of understanding its significance were also the people who had been categorized, by the containment mechanism Nathan had described, as the people least worth taking seriously. Governments, when the publication received enough circulation to prompt official inquiries, denied the existence of any program matching the description. The denials were precise and careful, carefully not claiming that atmospheric research did not occur, carefully not claiming that weather modification was not a topic of scientific interest, carefully limited to the specific claim that no classified operational deployment program of the kind described existed. Eli, who had spent a year learning to read the language of institutional denial, noted the precision with a kind of tired appreciation. Scientists argued, as scientists should, about the feasibility of everything in the document, the scale of deployment, the undetectability of the fleet, the chemistry of the claimed dispersal agents, the atmospheric modelling in the termination scenario document. Some of the arguments were substantive, and some were not. and Eli did not have the credentials or the institutional standing to participate in them on equal terms. He published his laboratory reports. He published Marcus's satellite analysis. He published the portions of the archive that were technical and verifiable, and did not, in his judgment, contain information whose release would itself constitute a harm. He did not publish the termination scenario document. He kept that in a folder on an encrypted drive. He backed it up in 3 separate locations. He told 4 people where to find it: his attorney, his elder daughter, the journalist in Denver, and Marcus Webb, with instructions that matched the instructions he'd given regarding the original ARI document years before. He did not know what would happen next. He did not know whether the program would continue, or whether the exposure he had created would eventually produce a pressure sufficient to compel a different outcome, or whether the containment mechanism was robust enough that his publication would be absorbed into the existing noise of the topic without changing anything that mattered. What he knew was what any careful observer of the Kansas sky could verify for themselves on any clear morning. The aircraft was still flying. The lines were still forming, slowly, methodically, each one emerging from a point on the eastern horizon, crossing the pale blue vault of the sky at a heading of approximately 240 degrees, and beginning its slow spread before the next one appeared, visible to everyone, explained to no one. Eli Harper watched them from his porch in the early light, coffee in hand, and thought about what Nathan had said, and about what the termination scenario document said, and about his granddaughter, who had asked him once why the clouds looked like lines. He had told her, airplanes make them. She had looked up and nodded, satisfied with the answer, the way children are satisfied when the world makes a simple kind of sense. He had not told her that the planes making them did not exist in any public registry. He had not told her about the aluminum and the barium and the strontium. He had not told her about the meeting in 2003, or the atmospheric reflectivity initiative, or the termination scenario. She was 9 years old. She had accepted the explanation that the sky was doing what the sky does, behaving according to rules she could understand and trust. He hoped she was right. He watched the lines spread. He finished his coffee. He went back inside. There is something uniquely disorienting about a conspiracy that cannot be fully disproved, not because the evidence is absent, but because the evidence, even in abundance, is insufficient to close the gap between knowing and proving. Eli Harper gathered more evidence than most people ever accumulate about anything. He had photographs. He had laboratory reports. He had satellite imagery. He had documents. He had Nathan. And he still could not be certain. Not with the legal certainty, not with the institutional certainty that would make the choice of disclosure clear and clean. That is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the story he has chosen to tell in partial form. Not the program itself, if it exists. Not the chemicals, not the aircraft, not the geopolitical architecture of a covert atmospheric intervention. The most unsettling thing is the structure of the uncertainty, because the uncertainty is not evenly distributed. The people running the program, if there is a program, are not uncertain. They know what they are doing and why and what the consequences of stopping would be. They have access to the full information set and they have made their choice, and they live with it each morning when they look up at the same sky. The people on the ground, the farmers and the satellite trackers and the researchers and the journalists and the people lying in the dark listening to this story, are uncertain. They have fragments. They have anomalies. They have the particular vertiginous feeling of someone who suspects that something is different about the light, but cannot prove it in a court of law. The uncertainty is a design feature, and somewhere above you, at an altitude your eye cannot quite resolve, in a layer of the atmosphere you will never visit, there may or may not be particles falling slowly through the cold blue dark, doing something to the light before it reaches you. The question that Eli Harper has never been able to fully answer, and the question that stays with everyone who hears his account in any form, is not whether the program existed. It is not even whether the science behind it was sound, or whether the people who built it believed they were doing the right thing. Those questions are, in a certain sense, answerable. History has a way of settling them eventually, one way or another, through the accumulation of evidence and the slow erosion of institutional protection around classified information. The question that does not resolve, that Eli carries with him on his porch every morning, coffee in hand, watching the sky, is what the right decision would have been, not for the program, for him, for Nathan, for Marcus, for every person who has found themselves in possession of information that the world has not given them the tools to know what to do with. There is a tradition in philosophy of thought experiments designed to test moral intuitions by placing individuals in situations where every available choice produces harm. The trolley problem, the ticking bomb, the runaway train. Philosophers construct these scenarios in the abstract, in the comfortable neutrality of academic language, because the point of the exercise is to isolate the moral structure of the choice from the weight of its real-world consequences. You're supposed to think clearly about them. You're supposed to arrive at a principle. Eli Harper had not been given the luxury of abstraction. He had been handed the actual files. He had made the actual calls. He had driven to the actual post office and mailed the actual copies of the actual documents to the actual attorney and the actual journalist. And then he had driven home on the actual highway through the actual Kansas farmland and looked at the actual sky and tried to decide what a person in possession of those particular facts owed to the rest of the people who were living beneath them. He had chosen a middle path. He had published enough to make the question alive without publishing enough to force an immediate response. He had, in the language of his own moral accounting, given the world the thread without giving it the full unravelling, on the grounds that the full unravelling, if it happened too fast, might collapse something that could not be rebuilt. Whether that was wisdom or cowardice, he told the 4 people who knew the full story, he could not say. He hoped it was wisdom. He suspected that most of the moral choices that matter most feel, to the people making them, like something in between. Nathan never contacted him again after the 11th call. Eli did not know whether Nathan was safe, or where he was, or whether the people running Operation Silver Veil had become aware of the archive he had sent. He knew only that the calls had stopped, and that the information had arrived, and that he was now the one carrying it. Marcus Webb continued his satellite analysis. He updated his database regularly. He did not publish his findings publicly. He had seen what happened to people who did, the way the containment mechanism processed them, the way the culture metabolized their careful observations into the raw material of ridicule. He kept his files, and he shared them with Eli, and he watched the sky from his converted garage in Salina, and he tracked the patterns with the patience of a man who has accepted that he will probably not live to see the resolution. Eli's elder daughter asked him once, during a visit 2 summers after the publication, whether he regretted any of it. He thought about the question for long enough that she began to think he had not heard her. Then he said, "I regret that it was necessary." She did not ask him to explain what he meant. The sky above the farm was clear that evening, the particular clear of a late summer day when the heat has finally relented and the air is still, and the first stars are beginning to be visible in the east. No lines, no grid, nothing overhead but the open blue depth of the atmosphere, and somewhere far above it, the darkness of space pressing down on everything with its ancient indifferent weight. He watched it for a while, then he went back inside. "Look up tomorrow morning, see what you see. Tonight, sleep well. The sky will still be there when you wake.